Okay, so you want to escape Devil's Island. You have read the books, you have seen the films, you have watched Henri Charrière float away on a bag of coconuts into the open Caribbean, and you have told yourself that a determined enough person can break out of anywhere. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you have been doing the math on what that actually required. Here is the problem. The math most people are doing is wrong. Not slightly wrong, completely wrong. Because what you see in the dramatized accounts of Devil's Island, the dramatic ocean jumps, the jungle sprints, the triumphant arrivals on Venezuelan shores has almost nothing to do with what escaping the Îles du Salut actually looked like from the inside. And the gap between those two pictures is where most escape attempts ended in death, recapture, or permanent disappearance. Before we talk about survival odds, we need to agree on what we are even talking about, because Devil's Island was not one place, it was a system. The French penal colony operated across 3 islands off the northeastern coast of French Guiana: Île Royale, Île Saint-Joseph, the smallest, most isolated landmass that gave the entire complex its name. Devil's Island itself housed only the most high-profile political prisoners. The majority of the 80,000 convicts transported there between 1852 and 1953 lived and died on Royale or Saint-Joseph. The distinction matters because the escape route, the risk profile, the survival probability were completely different depending on which island you started from. Getting this wrong was not a minor miscalculation. It was a fatal one. Here is what the geography actually imposed on anyone considering a break. The Îles du Salut sit approximately 14 kilometers off the coast of mainland French Guiana. That sounds manageable. It is not. The channel between the islands and the shore runs through some of the most hydrodynamically hostile water in the Atlantic basin. The prevailing currents in that corridor move at between 2 and 4 knots on a normal day. During the rainy season, that runs from December through June, surface currents accelerate and wave heights in the open water regularly exceed 2 meters. A man swimming without a flotation device in that channel against an opposing current has a forward speed advantage of roughly 0. The French administration understood this perfectly. The ocean was not incidental to the security architecture of the Îles du Salut. The ocean was the wall. And here is what finishes most escape calculations before they begin. The water surrounding the islands does not just push back. It is biologically active in ways that compound the physical difficulty. Bull sharks and tiger sharks patrol the channel between Royale and the mainland in documented numbers. The warm, nutrient-rich outflow from the Moroni and Oyapock rivers creates feeding conditions that concentrate apex predators in exactly the corridor any escaping prisoner would have to cross. French prison records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries document at least 30 confirmed shark-related fatalities among attempted escapees, though administrators frequently log disappearances without cause, meaning the actual figure is almost certainly higher. The structural survival mismatch of an ocean crossing from the Îles du Salut is one of the most severe in any escape scenario in documented history. The official French administration classified escape attempts into 3 categories, each with its own statistical profile. A simple break was an unplanned, opportunistic run, usually from a work detail on the mainland coast rather than from the islands themselves. A constructed evasion involved premeditated preparation, accumulated materials, and a planned departure window. A coordinated flight required outside assistance, usually a contact vessel or a mainland accomplice with access to currency and transport. The success rates across these 3 categories were not comparable. Simple breaks had a documented recapture or death rate of approximately 97%. Constructed evasions fared marginally better, with survival and successful arrival somewhere outside French jurisdiction occurring in roughly 8 to 12% of documented cases. Coordinated flights, which required money, connections, and months of preparation, succeeded at a rate closer to 25%, but represented fewer than 6% of all attempts on record. The preparation cost of a serious constructed evasion was significant inside the prison economy. Convicts who survived long enough to accumulate resources operated within a black market system. The guards largely tolerated because eliminating it entirely proved operationally impossible. The internal currency of the camps was the plan, a hidden cache of money, usually franc notes sealed in a small metal or rubber cylinder and concealed internally. A well-funded plan on Île Royale in the 1920s held between 500 and 5,000 francs. At the equivalent purchasing power inside the colony, 1,000 francs represented approximately 8 months of reliable access to additional food rations, medical favors, and guard complicity. The bribery economy was not optional for a serious escape attempt. It was the infrastructure. A prisoner attempting a constructed evasion without a meaningful plan was operating with a structural funding deficit from the start. The raft problem was where most prepared attempts collapsed into failure. Building a functional ocean-capable flotation device inside a guarded island penal colony required sourcing materials across a timeline of months without triggering inspection. The preferred materials were coconut husks sealed in canvas or salvaged rubber. lashed to a bamboo or timber frame using cordage stripped from work materials. A raft capable of supporting one person with minimal supplies across 14 kilometers of open water required between 40 and 60 large coconuts as flotation. A frame of at least 8 bamboo poles, each 3 meters in length. Binding strong enough to survive wave impact for 4 to 6 hours of active transit. Sourcing those materials individually across a 6-month preparation window without detection required either extraordinary discipline or reliable guard cooperation. Most attempts used one or the other. The ones that used neither did not survive the channel. Navigation presented the next layer of compounding difficulty. The crossing from Royale to the mainland coast is not a straight-line transit. The current vectors in the channel push eastward, meaning a prisoner launching from the western face of Royale needed to aim his departure significantly upwind, an upcurrent of his intended landing point, to arrive anywhere near a survivable stretch of coast. The jungle coastline of French Guiana offers very few viable landing points. Between the mouth of the Kourou River and the Maroni River estuary, a distance of roughly 250 kilometers, the coast is dominated by mangrove swamp, shallow mud flat, standing water that extends inland for several kilometers before reaching dry ground. A prisoner arriving at the wrong point on that coastline did not face jungle. He faced an inescapable biological barrier with no firm footing, no potable water, no directional reference other than the sun. The mainland itself was the second wall of the system. French Guiana in the colonial era maintained a network of forest wardens and civilian informants along the coastal interior. The administration paid a bounty for returned or confirmed dead escapees. In the 1920s, that bounty was set at 100 francs per confirmed recapture. That in a territory with virtually no wage economy represented a meaningful financial incentive for any local population near the coast. Escaped convicts who made landfall without money, language capacity in local Creole or indigenous dialects, knowledge of which settlements were sympathetic versus informant-linked, died in the jungle, or walked back into custody within 2 weeks. The trust deficit facing a newly arrived escapee in the coastal communities of French Guiana was absolute. He had no reputation, no contacts, no currency, and a shaved head that marked him instantly. The viable escape corridor that actually worked and documented successful cases followed a specific economic and geographic logic. The destination was not France. The destination was British Guiana to the west, later Guyana, or Venezuela further along the coast. British colonial authorities had a formal policy of non-return for French convicts who crossed the border under their own means, not out of humanitarian principle. But because returning them required administrative engagement with the French colonial bureaucracy that the British found more costly than simply releasing the man. Venezuela maintained a similar effective policy, particularly in the regions around the Orinoco Delta, where central government authority was thin enough that an arriving escapee could disappear into the local population within days. The successful escape from Devil's Island was not a dramatic flight to freedom. It was a supply chain problem with a specific terminus, and the ones who solved it correctly survived. Henri Charrière's account, published in 1969 as Papillon, became the defining popular narrative of Devil's Island escape. The academic and historical scrutiny of that account reveals a more complicated picture. Charrière's crossing used a coconut sack raft and relied on the specific current behavior at a particular point on Royale's coastline that experienced prisoners knew would push a floating body toward the Venezuelan coast rather than into open ocean. The timing of the departure coincided with a tidal window of approximately 4 hours during which the eastward deflection current weakened enough to permit directional movement. That window was not discoverable through guesswork. It was transmitted through the internal knowledge economy of the penal colony, passed from prisoner to prisoner over decades. Represented the single most valuable piece of operational intelligence available to anyone planning a water crossing. The prisoners who survived long enough to receive that information and had the resources to act on it were the ones with any real probability of success. The French administration's response to the persistent escape problem evolved across the century of the colony's operation. Early in the system's history, the punishment for recaptured escapees was an additional sentence of between 2 and 5 years served in the solitary confinement cells of Île Saint-Joseph. A block of individual stone cells where prisoners spent 23 hours per day in enforced silence under a punishment regime that prison inspectors from the French metropolitan government documented as producing psychosis in a measurable percentage of inmates within 6 months. By the 1930s, the administration added an automated notification system to the nearest British and Venezuelan coastal authorities. That closed the non-return policy gap that earlier escapees had exploited. The window of viable escape, already narrowed further with each administrative adaptation. The colony officially closed in 1953, and the last prisoners were repatriated to France. By that point, the system had processed more than 80,000 convicts across a century of operation. The number of successful escapes that resulted in permanent freedom outside French jurisdiction sits at fewer than 2.000 by the most generous historical estimates. That is a success rate below 2.5% across the entire operational life of the colony.